Reflections on a world without a worldview. Nearly 10 years ago, I recorded a film about the state, as I saw it, of our world in terms of worldviews. By worldview, I mean this total approach which a civilization or group of people have towards things like time and space and class and gender and all the things in life that are a kind of cosmology surrounding us, often invisible more or less, and not dissimilar to what some people call paradigms, which are theoretical systems which enable us to understand the world by telling us what are the questions we should ask and what are the sort of answers that we can accept. And this first talk, as I say, was nearly 10 years ago, and I've had requests from my YouTube supporters that I update it. So this is what I am attempting to do now in February 2023. The previous one was written, I think, in around 2014 for a book on how do we know, and then recorded. So what is the situation as I see it now, 10 years older, in my early 80s rather than my early 70s, and a very changed world? Well, the idea before, the rough scheme, was that certainly in Western civilizations over the last 1,000 years, we've been through several major shifts in our worldview. The first was in the period of the Renaissance and the scientific revolution, when we moved from a circular view of time and causation to one of progress, of new things, of lineal time. And that's a 15th, 16th, 17th century phenomenon going through into the Enlightenment. Then, after a small reversal, we had a second major worldview, which was evolutionary. Civilizations and biological systems, as Darwin was showing, evolve and change dramatically, and there is a period of outward expansion of empires and rapid evolutionary thought in all fields, including my own of history and anthropology. And then the 20th century, the shock of the First World War and other things, meant that we moved to a third major worldview, which I call structuralism, which includes different branches, including an approach which we call functionalism, that we look at the function of things rather than their origins. And this lasted through until the 1970s, 80s. And this was the subject of a set of lectures I gave on cosmologies of capitalism, which was on YouTube as well. And I stopped my story in about 1989 and the fall of the Soviet Union. So the reflections on a world without a worldview was taking that story on and saying that what happened after that, between 1990 and 2010 roughly. And what I argued was that there was a huge fragmentation, that you could no longer talk about, in the West anyway, a worldview, that there were many contesting worldviews, and this was caused by changes in political systems, technologies and other things, and it led to a certain pessimism in my account, because basically I was describing a fragmentation where, in the poetic phrase, the centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, according to Yeats's poem. And here everyone had their own worldview, and you couldn't say this is what the question is and this is what the answer is in any discipline, because there were many different views of that matter. So it was like a rushing waterfall, and it was characterized by a feeling that all the theoretical systems that had existed before were dead, and we were living in what was called a post-world. So it was post-modernism after the modern world, post-structuralism after the structural world, post this and post that. So we knew what we were reacting against, but what were we for? And that is the account I gave, and that's where I ended the story. Now, taking that on another 10 years, what has happened and what are my views? Well, the first thing is that on the surface, the situation has become much more fragmented and post than it was before. There are a number of obvious reasons for this. One is that one of the main causes of, as I saw it, of this fragmentation, which was communications media, and the fact that the internet and cell phones and so on were meaning that instead of one source of truth, there were many, many disputed and alternative ways of spreading your views and finding out information. This obviously has multiplied hugely. If we thought that artificial intelligence and the internet and so on were advanced in 2014, nearly 10 years later, it's far, far stronger. And so we are flooded with images, ideas, messages from all over the world on television channels and on our mobile phones. So any sense of security in an enclosed and certain framework is shattered much more in the last 10 years. And this has had its undermining effects on all sorts of things, on gender relations, on our views of religion, our views of politics, our views of each other, and combined with various cultural wars which have developed, for example, the Me Too movement, and the assertiveness of all sorts of minority views of the world. That means we live in a much more fragmented and post-world than we did before. And on top of that is piled the fact that we have had leaders who seem to relish that world. Two obvious ones were Donald Trump, and in Britain, to a smaller extent, Boris Johnson. Both of them basically lived in a post-factual or post-truth world. They were both liars. That was why the British got rid of Johnson, because of his lying, and perhaps in America. And indeed, Trump made a great virtue of attacking any institution, any school of thought, and proclaiming what were evident lies. They used to count them up, and there were thousands and millions of lies he was telling every day, well, over his time. And so we lived in a world where our leaders didn't believe in truth or facts, and this also was something of a shock. It was clear that politicians have always lied, but it hasn't been nearly as flagrant as that. And then other things. The flood of people, refugees, migrations, which had been growing over the end of the 20th century, has escalated. And so even in my small village in the fens of Cambridgeshire, in the last 5 years, the number of people from all sorts of parts of the world, Africa, Asia, Europe and elsewhere, has increased hugely, dramatically, so that it seems, walking around, that perhaps up to a quarter of people are from different civilizations to mine now in this small village, and that multiplied all over the world. means that we are in touch with other ways of thinking and other cultural traditions in a way that wasn't so prevalent before. Then another feature has been COVID. This is quite recent, but now in 2023 we're just coming out of 3 years of a total shock to many of our deeper convictions about work and space and people and disease and so on. And it has undermined many certainties about what the purpose of life is and what the questions are that we should be facing. So in some ways we are in a more fragmented, as I say, world, a more post-modern world. But there are things to be said in mitigation, as it were, or on reflection. One of these is that as I thought more about this, and as I looked at the history of my own civilization in other ways, I see that this is not a new phenomenon. This is something I constantly tell younger people. Don't panic, because we've been through this before. And I hadn't really applied it seriously to this phenomenon of postmodernism and post-this and living in a world without a worldview. But if you look at any period of history, and some dramatic examples, for example, the fall of the Roman Empire and the sweeping in of the Germanic peoples, this was a time of half a millennium when all sorts of different worldviews, including strange Aryan heresies and thoughts from different parts of the world, were sweeping across Europe, and there was a huge amount of uncertainty and disagreement about the fundamental framework of thinking, right through to the medieval period. And then in the medieval period there was the import of many new ideas from the Islamic world and the beginning of the revival of classical learning. So again, our medieval thinkers were not thinking in a closed paradigm. They were considering all sorts of alternatives. Then this was hugely magnified from the middle of the 15th century with the new discoveries, Columbus in America, voyages to Asia, and through the next couple of hundred years, Europe was flooded with alternative worldviews, as it were. Often they were in the form of actual material objects, new plants, new building styles, new bits of language. All sorts of things came in, so that the European situation, for example, in the Mediterranean and cities like Venice, was one of many different swirling currents of ideas, contested ideas. And so if you read the essays of Montaigne, for example, in the later 16th century, it is a world with many worldviews reflected in those essays. And this continued so that it became an open world with contested theoretical systems. That shock occurred again in a dramatic form in the 19th century, in the middle of the 19th century, with again huge imperial expansions and new ideas from geology and biology which were undermining the conventional Western theories of time and the Bible and other things. And so you got many poets like Tennyson and others and writers who reflected on the fact that the world seemed very confused, very uncertain. All that they were brought up with was challenged. And so the Victorians were not as assured and one-minded as people might think. They were exploring and trying to get to terms with all sorts of clashes in their theoretical systems. And so what then happened in the later part of the 20th century that I've described is nothing new. It may seem to us to be more severe, but if you'd said this to the people before, they'd say, no, well, you have other certainties which we didn't have in terms of medicine and all sorts of ways of life which were uncertain in our days. And so your position is not really fundamentally different from ours. So that was one set of reflections. The world without a worldview is something worth thinking about. It's not new. Another reflection is that it's not at all uncommon. Indeed, the idea that you have a Western civilization with a fixed set of theoretical systems, internally consistent and thorough, is perhaps exceptional. This has become more obvious to me as I looked eastwards and I learnt more about cultures in India, Japan, China, the 2/3 of the world which is outside the European and Anglosphere traditions. I'd understood this earlier when I looked at Japan, but the effects of Japan hadn't really sunk in, and likewise China, which I visited a number of times, but as I thought about it more in recent years, I realized that both China and Japan, and to a large extent India, don't have a world with a worldview. If you look at, for example, China, what is the worldview over its 2,000 years history? It hasn't had a single worldview. It's had 4 or 5 different worldviews, all coexisting. So perhaps the oldest is the nature religion of China, Taoism, the Tao, which is thousands of years old and gives you a worldview. If you are in a simple shamanic society, it's your worldview. But on top of that, and contesting bits of it, were other more recent worldviews. One was Confucianism, 4th, 5th century BC, Confucius, Mencius, and others set out a worldview, a relational, structural view of the world, which was very different from Taoism, Lao Tse's view, and the two somehow coexisted with each other. And then half a millennium later, in the 1st century or 2nd century of our millennium, of the Western Christian time system, Buddhism came into China. And Buddhism, again, is very different in its premises, its attitudes, its concepts of the person, of space, of time, of everything, to both Taoism and Confucianism. And yet somehow they accommodated to each other. Buddhism was changed greatly, but it remained and brought in fresh, new, contesting views. And alongside all those, there was ancestral veneration, a family system, and a world of spirits and ancestors, which coexisted and still exists in China. So China had at least 5 different systems alongside each other, and then in the last couple of 100 years it's been pummeled with another worldview, which is the Western worldview, partly political, economic, social, legal, coming in from more strongly in the 19th century and very strongly in the last 20-30 years. But also with the missionaries and Christianity providing alternatives and apparently inconsistent ways of thinking. So China is, in parallel, a whole set of different paradigms and worldviews, And obviously the same is true of Japan in almost identical forms. And then again, if you look at India, you have all sorts of contesting ancient systems and modern systems jostling together. So humans in great civilizations have learnt to live with different worldviews and not be thrown by this. And then a last thought or reflection came out of work which I did during COVID, where I came to a solution of a problem about how we can be both rational in the Western sense of dividing our lives up into sensible portions and behaving rationally, and also to live in a meaningful and imaginative world. And I describe this in my recently published book, Magic and Modernity. And my solution was that this is something that, as I described there, the Asian civilizations have done for centuries, and we do it in a different way, in that we in the West have what I call oasis or bubble systems, whereby we lead a fairly reasonable, rational life in much of our doings, in our work patterns and in our social relations and so on. But using our imaginations, we spend much of our time, most of our time probably, in little bubbles of meaning, which are not guided by the rational rules of the market and democracy and so on. And I describe these things like music and novels and drama. All the different arts are ways of escaping, as it were, into a meaningful life. And so most people watching television or reading a book or listening to music live in other parallel bubble worlds. And the same with games and sports, football and cricket, and all these things are little bounded communities or bubbles of meaning. And then we have other things like love and stimulants like drink and so on. So that if you chart the life of a Western, supposedly rational individual like myself, most of it is spent in escaping, not escaping, but living in more meaningful worlds. And so we can cope with what Weber despaired of, the iron cage of rationality, because we don't live in an iron cage. We just have to say, let's pretend, and we're off anywhere we like. And so we can do that, and that solution to that problem made me realize that maybe there is the same solution to the problems of loss of a uniform paradigm or world view. It is true that that loss makes certain branches of academic life more difficult, because when I was learning my subject of anthropology, you knew what the framework was, what the questions you should be asking, and what were your colleagues would find were reasonable answers within what was then known as a functional or structural functional approach, and the same later with structuralism in different disciplines. That has gone, and so when I look at my colleagues' work, I can see that they are going in all sorts of different directions, and they have little groups who agree with them that this is the question, but there is no overarching approach as there seemed to be when I was learning history and anthropology, and I think that is going to be a continuing situation. So there is something lost there. On the other hand, we can cope with it perfectly well by creating these bubbles and oases and sub-parts, and so there is huge dynamism, huge experimentation, and huge hope as well. So the world is both more confused than when I talked before, and it's confused in a way which, one other thing that I didn't mention, which has interested me, the growth of a way of reconciling opposites, not by saying this is right and this is wrong, by binary thinking, but rather by quantum thinking, which is what you get in Asia, both and thinking, so that we can live in a world where things are not so simply true or false as we thought, but they are both and this leads to a degree of flexibility and an ability to cope with what would otherwise be extremely worrying ambiguities or clashes or confrontations. So if we relax in realizing that our situation is not absolutely new and unparalleled, and also that human beings all over the world have dealt with this in different ways and that we can deal with it, then the rather depressing tone of my previous talk is ameliorated in many ways. And thinking of the friendships I've made through COVID and new promises of the future, I think that we can, as human beings, deal with this and live in a world which is much more pluralistic and understanding of differences and contested differences, but without leading to repression and fear. Thank you.